And right now, I think you see governments and companies trying to find the right balance between responding to the demands for more resilient supply chains, but also doing so in a way that isn't too costly or too disruptive that you actually slow the rate of technological progress. And I think for a lot of governments that have focused on semiconductors really for the first time in a long time, they've had to learn a lot about how the industry is structured, learn a lot about these far-flung international supply chains, learn a lot about technology that until recently governments didn't have to know too much about. So there's been a lot of learning going on in basically all of the world's major governments about how exactly these supply chains actually work.
And who's working with whom?
Well, I think
more important, who's not working with whom?
But the big shift is that 5 years ago, China was beginning to play a bigger and bigger role in the international supply chain. Today, China is not playing a bigger role in the international supply chain. China is playing a bigger role in building up its own supply chain. And so you've got a bifurcation that is, I think, gaining steam, where China is building more capabilities domestically, trying to do so autonomously, and at the same time, other countries like the United States, like Japan, are trying to cut China off from cutting-edge technologies. And so I think what we're going to have developing is that bifurcation will continue. China's going to get better and better at doing more on its own, but it'll still be behind the international supply chain, which is going to benefit from the fact that it can draw on the expertise of Japan and of Korea and of Taiwan and of the US and of India, all of whom are actually happy to have a supply chain that's less reliant on China for a variety of different reasons.
So you were telling me something very interesting, that of late, whenever you've gone to Taiwan, you haven't been able to meet a lot of people because many of them are in India.
That's right.
How do you see that marriage happening?
Well, I think there's
what are people in Taiwan saying?
Well, in Taiwan, I think there's two factors that are changing the China-Taiwan relationship and therefore the China-India relationship, the Taiwan-India relationship. One is that Taiwanese firms are looking at the Chinese market and saying, our prospect for future growth here is limited. The Chinese want to replace us. Anyway, the Chinese economy is slowing. They need to find new markets. And India, I think, is one of the biggest markets that they can approach. Second, Taiwanese firms are responding because other parts of the supply chain are saying, we want less reliance on China. And so if you listen to the big computer assemblers, for example, or the big smartphone assemblers that are non-Chinese, they're all asking their supply chains to develop more alternatives to Chinese suppliers. And India is a natural place to turn for design, for test and assembly, for device assembly, if you're trying to look to diversify from China. And so for the Taiwanese firms that actually do device assembly, that do a lot of the assembly and test of semiconductors, and that also do a lot of design, I think it's quite natural to turn to India as a source of that diversification.
And what are India's three core advantages and strengths that you see?
I think the advantages differ based on where you look in the supply chain. So if you start with chip design, for example, there are more people working in chip design in India than anywhere else in the world. So the labor force is just very, very deep, which is why there already are a lot of multinational firms with offices in India. And we heard just this morning the news from Qualcomm setting up a facility in Tamil Nadu. And I think that's not a surprise to hear that. And Taiwanese firms, Taiwanese chip design firms see the same thing. If you look at other parts of the supply chain, like the assembly and test of semiconductors, there are different assets that India has. The growth in the electronics ecosystem, for example, in this state, is going to contribute, I think, to more interest in assembly and test. Finally, if you look at certain types of semiconductors, you'll find that there's a desire in the auto industry, for example, and medical devices, to have more confidence that your semiconductor supply chains are nearby. And so whether it's the Indian auto industry or the North American auto industry, I hear more and more companies that say, we want to have local suppliers. And I think for companies in India that are selling into Indian manufacturing supply chains, that's a real opportunity.